if you're a member of the base, or if you're an interest group or someone who wants to be involved in politics, and you have to decide, am I going to trust this politician? Am I going to throw my credibility behind them? Am I going to try to help them get elected, give them my time, my money, my attention, my admiration? And you don't want to be rolled. You don't want to be tricked into giving away all of those things in exchange for nothing. Right? It would be really bad if you were, say, a union in, say, Kentucky in, say, the 1980s, and a politician named Mitch McConnell comes up and says, hey, I know I'm a Republican, but I know you don't like the Democrat. You should support me and I'll back you. And then you support them, and then after their first election win, they immediately turn on you, throw you in the dustbin, and then now they've achieved a level of power where it's hard to get them uprooted, and you're basically shut out of Kentucky politics forever. Right? That would be a bad outcome. You don't want that. You want to avoid it. So how do you avoid it? One of the ideas for avoiding it is that you choose only the true believers, and you act violently and quickly against the people who show any sign of falling apart. Right? This is a good idea if you really want to be sure that you're getting what you're paying for, but it's not always going to lead to the best outcomes, in my opinion. So we can take Mamdani for an example. Right? Mamdani is the face of democratic socialism in the United States. He is the face of left-wing politics. He is the face of Muslim politics to an extent. He is the face of New York City now, and he's an extremely talented politician who is trying very hard to get his base what they wanted and get the voters what they voted for. And he's charismatic. And because of his charisma, people pay attention to what he does. He has a lot of very normal and ordinary behaviors. Early on, he's cut funds from wasteful programs and repaired a few bridges and repaired some potholes. Did basically normal mayor of New York stuff. And he's getting a lot of attention for it because it's framed. So it's framed in a different way. It's framed as if he is finally getting into office and shaking things up and doing things for the people. Oh my God, he just hit the be good at governance button that no one ever decided to hit. That was a switch that nobody could flip, right? And he did it for the first time. That's the narrative that Mamdani has because he's extremely charismatic and people like him. And people listen to what he says, and what he does gets on the news, and people see what he does, what they would not have seen from other politicians who did the same. And that's a big advantage if you're charismatic. That's like a huge reason why you would want to pick a charismatic politician, because you know that when they do the things that you like that are popular, people are going to listen, whereas with a normal, boring politician, they might not. And so there's a good, I think, logical theory of why you would want to always select a charismatic politician. But there's sometimes the charismatic politician is so charismatic that their support outstrips the support that you as an interest group might have. So if you are a hardcore left-wing person, Mamdani might actually not be that appealing right now. I know there's a lot of people who are complaining about him publicly. They tend to get drowned out in the conversations online, or at least shouted down by people who I think are acting in good faith and are doing the correct thing and shouting those people down. But you get shouted down, right? And because he is more charismatic, then the interest group is appealing or credible or convincing. And you run the risk as an interest group, and the interest group could mean anything. It could be people who are interested in the economy, or people who are interested in ecology or saving the climate, or just left-wing politics in general. But you run the risk of getting shut down and shut out if the politician wins their power and then they don't have to listen to you anymore, right? They can just move on from you. They don't need you anymore. Thank you, goodbye, next. And Mamdani doesn't really have this problem because, or at least if you're on the left wing, this is very concerning, right? You don't really want to give Mamdani all this power and praise if he's going to turn around and just be a normal, boring centrist, like you suspect all politicians secretly are desperate to be. So, what do you do? What is your strategy if you've backed a charismatic politician and they start to backslide a little bit? They start to move away from you. I have what I think are some good examples of politicians who have rolled their base to the benefit of the base. And I think that might help illuminate things. And my two examples are a guy named Lyndon B. Johnson and a guy named, I'm blanking on his name. Idaho, Frank Church. I'm going to use an example from history. Two figures who were alive at the same time they worked together: Lyndon Johnson and Frank Church. Lyndon Johnson, famously, was the president of the United States after Kennedy got assassinated. But before he was president, he was the Senate Majority Leader. In fact, he was the youngest Senate Majority Leader who was ever alive. He is an extremely talented politician, a political entrepreneur, as he's described in many books. He was really good at figuring out what people wanted and positioning himself between them and their ability to get it, and extracting political benefits out of them. Right? This is very simple, basic political stuff, and he was a genius at it. He would create desires that people had they didn't even know. Right? One of the famous LBJ stories that's told in Master of the Senate is how either when he was in the House or early in his Senate career, there was a congressional delegations committee or an office, some people who were in charge of congressional delegations. And it was boring paperwork. No one wanted to do it. But he saw an opportunity because congressmen like congressional delegations. And even though most of the higher ups get to choose what delegations are held and where they go and who's invited, there's usually a couple seats that are open and can be given to backbenchers or given to people who otherwise might not have gotten it. And LBJ takes over as the guy in charge of these congressional delegations, and he becomes really good at running it, so much so that it relies on him. They have to have him for them to operate efficiently. He basically insinuates them into the way that it's run. And now he's able to give out favors by sending people on congressional delegations that otherwise wouldn't get on. And he becomes their hope. This is the important thing. He becomes their hope. And when you're somebody's hope, they're willing to give you a lot in exchange for what they want. Another thing that LBJ did was he became the hope of the racist, segregationist, reactionary Southerners, because they knew that you could never get a Southern president in the United States after the Civil War. It was too difficult. The culture was just not there. It was just not ready. So along comes this guy, LBJ, who seems like he has actually the ability to make good with the liberal side of the party sometimes, who's very talented, who insinuates himself as the mentee of the leader of the Southern Caucus. And suddenly they think this is a guy that can run for president. This is a guy that could win and could deliver the presidency both to the Democratic Party, which had been losing to Republicans, and to the South. Right? We can bring the South back into the rest of the country. So LBJ becomes the hope of the Southerners. And because he's the hope of the Southerners, they give him a lot of leeway to do things that otherwise he would not be able to do. At the same time, LBJ wants to be president, right? He doesn't just pretend to want to be president to get their, hope invested in him. He wants to be president in real life. So he knows he needs the liberals on board to support this run. So what does he do? He starts talking to the liberals. He starts behaving more liberal, acting in a way to make him seem more liberal, or at least more palatable to liberals, and starts passing a shit ton of bills in the Senate so that he can demonstrate to the liberals, I know you don't love me, but I'm okay with what you want to get done, and I'm the only one who can accomplish it. I'm the only one in the Senate who's talented enough to get anything through here because the Senate is such a quagmire and nothing can get done. Hello, I shot the first half of that video last week and lost track of time. The second half of the video did not actually record. I was going to shoot the second half today, but it's really nice outside, so I thought I would film the rest of it today. But getting back to LBJ, he succeeds in his mission to prove to people that he's the only one who can pass things out of the Senate. He gets a bunch passed. There's all these articles written about him, about how great he is and how he's master of the Senate. But it's not enough to convince the Washington Post crowd and the liberals in the North who are sort of suspicious of him. So he needs something really big, something that's really going to set him apart. And the bill that he chooses is the Voting Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It's a big bill. There's a lot in it. It's got good things. And there's no way that it's going to get through the Senate. It's absolutely dead in the water. The Southerners are going to filibuster it. They're not going to let it through the committees that they control. There's basically no way for it to pass. And LBJ sees this as a big opportunity because if he can get it passed, then he's the guy. Like, he's the guy in charge. And the liberals are going to love him, and the Southerners are going to, hopefully keep putting up with it. So to pass the bill, he needs the Southerners on board. But if the Southerners are on board, it's not going to be a good bill. And if the Southerners are on board, that might not even be a bill, because the Southerners don't like the Civil Rights Act. So a couple compromises have to be made. One, the Southerners have to compromise to allow him to pass this bill to prove to the liberals that he can be president, to help them get their own guy in the White House, right? They expect that he wants to be president. This is a big deal for them. So they're gonna try to help him along. And that means, two, they're gonna have to be willing to agree to a couple of different compromises, basically allow the bill to pass at all. But if they're going to allow the bill to pass, they have to be assured that it's not that dangerous. And so the way they clip the danger is something called a jury trial amendment. So the third compromise is the jury trial amendment. And what the jury trial amendment says is that any violation of the Civil Rights Act is going to be prosecuted by a local jury, a jury that's based where the event occurred. And if the crimes are occurring in the South, that's going to be a white Southern jury. That's not going to go well for the cause of civil rights. And so the Southerners basically know that they can allow this bill through because even though it's an attack on their institutions and an attack on what they care about, the jury trial, they can tell their constituents, like, there's a jury trial, nothing's going to matter. This is pretty obvious. It's pretty clear what this is. The Northerners are insulted by it and they don't like it. And the liberals certainly think it shouldn't be allowed to go through. And under normal circumstances, that would be enough to totally kill the whole thing. But LBJ is, because he's able to pass so much, also the hope of liberals that they can pass their own preferences. And there's a couple issues in the Senate that are really big and really important to those Northern liberals that they have not made any progress on. And the really big issue is public power. So at this part of American history, there's a lot of big national public resources that are getting invested in for the first time at a really systemic level. And one of those is public hydroelectric. So what they do is they have you have a canyon between two mountains that's next to a river. You find ones that are really deep and really narrow, and you build a concrete wall between them, and that's going to dam up the river and get you a huge hydroelectric dam that you can use to power turbines and bring power to people. Liberals who are in the FDR wing of the party, they really like public power, and they think that the power should be used to the benefit of the people, especially the poor white people in the area. Conservatives, people who are more market-oriented, they think that they should essentially sell our natural resources to private investors to the highest bidder and basically let them operate them for profit, which I think is a pretty bad way to use your national resources. So LBJ spots an opportunity where there are two groups that don't necessarily need to get in each other's way. They're getting in each other's way for ideological reasons and not for practical political reasons. So one group is in the South, and it's the Southern conservatives who don't like public power. They've seen the Tennessee Valley Authority under FDR, and they think it's actually a bad thing. They don't want any public power. They want private industry to be in charge of our natural resources. And so for ideological reasons, they're refusing to allow these power plants to get built. On the other end, you have the Northern liberals who are mostly in the Mountain West, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. These are places where you have a lot of these guys. And in maybe the Pacific Northwest, you could call it. And these guys, they really care about public power. Public power is so important. You have this one really important senator, Frank Church, who, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself because I filmed the first half of the video 2 weeks ago. You have this really important young, boyish senator named Frank Church, who is elected out of Idaho, or Oregon. Idaho or Oregon. The Hell's Canyon Dam is on the border, and I always forget which one. I think it's from Idaho. And Frank Church runs against an incumbent Republican senator who is supporting private power. And Frank Church says, no, fuck you. He doesn't say that, but he says, no, fuck you. This is for public power. Hell's Canyon should be a public power dam that supplies electricity to the neighboring states at low costs. So, and he wins that election by a huge margin. And it makes his career initially that he comes into the Senate supporting this bill. I mean, he's carried by the support for public power into the Senate. And he doesn't say anything in the Senate for a long time. He's silent on a bunch of really big, important issues because his maiden speech is about the Hells Canyon Dam. And it's a beautiful, well-orated, widely reported speech. And so for Frank Church, the Hells Canyon Dam and public power is like the central issue. And LBJ notices something, which is that the southern states, their opposition to public power is in most cases ideological. They're not actually near any of these dams. It doesn't really, there's not, the electric companies aren't paying them, at least not as much as they would if they were locals. And the Northerners, they don't have a lot of black people in their states. These are very white-oriented societies up in the Pacific Northwest. And the voters of the Pacific Northwest are good liberals, and they support, for the most part, civil rights and the advancements of those causes, but there's not a lot of organized groups in the Northwest that are going to be a big problem. There's not a big voting base that's going to cause problems for any liberal in the Northwest. So you can now, you can see there's sort of room for a trade here, where the Northwestern liberals, they want someone on their side who's powerful and successful and can pass bills. And they care about power. And they want public power. And so they're willing to maybe hold their nose when a jury trial amendment is proposed to the Civil Rights Bill, because they want to support civil rights and they're happy to vote for the Civil Rights Bill. And if, there's a complication that makes it so that it's not actually a very good bill because of the specific amendment, they're willing to look the other way and ignore that, because there's not going to be a lot of people in their states to get mad at them. And so LBJ organizes and he engineers this trade. And the trade is not secret. I mean, they try to keep it secret, but it's pretty obvious to the people who watch the press, right? The press is all over this. It's widely discussed in the news at the time. It's in all the newspapers that it's pretty clear the Northern liberals have traded their votes on a jury trial amendment in exchange for support for public power. There's a couple Northern liberals who don't agree with this trade, and they're really publicly against it. I think Wayne Morse is, one of the names of the senators who are really against it. The super liberal, ideological members of the Senate, they really oppose this. But for the most part, in the Northwest, the liberals get in line, and they get what they trade for. They get a bill that supports the Hells Canyon Dam, and the Southerners get their jury trial amendment and their civil rights bill for LBJ to help him become president. There's an unfortunate detail that goes with this, which is that both of those bills are essentially shams, right? The Hells Canyon Dam, as predicted, the bill does not make it through the House. It succeeds in the Senate, but it fails in the House, and it doesn't ever come to anything else. It succeeds in the House, or it succeeds in the Senate, and it fails in the House, and they build 3 small private dams eventually. It takes them a long time to actually get to it. And the Civil Rights Bill with the jury trial amendment, it's great for LBJ's political career, but it really doesn't do all that much, because the jury trial amendment invalidates a lot of, there's not actually going to be injustice there. And so you would think that because they are both sort of bills, all sound and fury signifying nothing, that should be the story, that they're bad and they're failures, and that we should hold, we should hold these politicians to account for their failures. And I think that would be justified take at the time. I think it would be justified to say that at the time, if you are trying to ensure that the politicians who get your support are actually on your side and they're not trying to trick you. But politicians don't just stick around for 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 cycles. I mean, these are people with a long shelf life. And I think it's worth considering things from a broader scope and a broader sense of things. And we can look at what happens to the careers of these politicians as a result of these basically scam bills, right? What actually happens in American history. And I think it's pretty illuminating that LBJ wanted to win with a coalition of liberals and, to a lesser extent, a coalition that he was getting support from, but eventually abandoning Southerners, Southern conservatives. And he wants that coalition, and he sees that that's a coalition he needs to win. And with this kind of sham bill, that helps ingratiate him into the commission enough that he can be he's a suitable candidate as John F. Kennedy's vice president, and eventually he becomes president. And then because that's the coalition that he built, and that's the coalition that through his agency he helped choose, and decides to go with, he is able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which are maybe the most consequential pieces of legislation, for at least for civil rights in the last 100 years or longer. And probably, arguably, no one could have done it if it wasn't for LBJ. I mean, LBJ had a special set of powers and a special set of supporters that made this possible for him to accomplish. And then on the other side, you have Frank Church, this young guy who made his career on this dam. He didn't think he was doomed in the House. I mean, Frank Church was, for the most part, a pretty earnest guy, but it was essentially a sham bill. LBJ knew when LBJ orchestrated this kind of behind Frank Church's back. LBJ knew that this is essentially a sham. It wasn't going to last. It wasn't going to work in the House. And Frank Church, kind of ignored him. And But this makes Frank Church's career. Frank Church becomes a really big deal in Idaho, his home state, because he's the only person who's been able to deliver this thing that people desperately want. And he doesn't actually deliver it, but he delivers as close as they get to it. And that gives him a lot of respect in the Senate. Now, I have to double check some of my sourcing on this, but my understanding is that Idaho goes through a sort of conservative wave. And if someone wasn't as positioned in such a position of strength as Frank Church, they might not have survived, and he might have been replaced by a Republican by the time that the 1970s rolls around. But in fact, Frank Church is in a really, really strong position because of that base of initial power and that coalition for social services that he helped build in the first term that he's in office. And eventually, the CIA does some stuff that's not great, and senators don't like it, and they decide in a Republican Senate that they're going to have hearings and they're going to have committees to investigate what it is that the intelligence agencies are up to. And Frank Church, he's a member of the minority, he's a Democrat, but that bill won him a lot of credibility in the Senate. And his general success won him a bunch of credibility. Sticking around for a long time gave him seniority, and that built him credibility. And essentially, the political profile that he built as a result of that sham bill gave him the credibility that actually members of the other party were able to say, yes, we're going to let you be in charge. You seem to really care about this. This is something that matters to you. You've demonstrated to us that you are not against American values in the Republican sense of the word. He demonstrated that he's not against national security issues, which is a position that he was partially able to stake out because the liberals liked him and liberals trusted him enough that he could stake out a sort of position that was maybe a little further away from the mainstream liberal one. And so in part because of that win, he's able to build up the credibility he needs to take advantage of a Republican chairman who can't serve on a committee, and he gets to serve on a committee that becomes something called the Church Commission. And the Church Commission oversees essentially an investigation of the intelligence agencies, and it uncovers MK Ultra. It uncovers the poisoning of fog in the city of San Francisco to test some fucking biochemical weapons that the CIA is trying out. It uncovers a lot of really nasty stuff, and most of the really bad stuff, the family jewels, most of the really bad stuff that we know about the CIA from this earlier than the 70s is from the Church Commission and his investigation, and would probably not have been investigated as thoroughly if it was done by a member of the Republican Party at the time who had less interest in uncovering this stuff, or by someone with less credibility and less sort of, without the personal talents that Frank Church had. And if you look at it even further, Frank Church instigates a lot of reforms in the intelligence community, which have led to a lot less abuses in the years. I mean, I'm not going to say that the CIA has never done anything wrong, although I mostly have the opinion that the bad stuff the CIA does is usually things that the president has asked them to do, and we sort of let the presidents off the hook and blame the CIA. But the intelligence agencies become a lot more accountable in the years after the Church Commission. And the Church Commission becomes the gold standard for how you do these sorts of things. And that could not have happened if it wasn't for these sham bills. And there's a lesson in that. I think the lesson is that you should, if you're an interest group, if you are part of a faction, if you're somebody who wants influence in the party, one of your tools is to be scrutinize super heavily all of the actions of the politicians that you want to support, and withdraw support at the first sign of capitulation or compromise or abandoning your principles. And I think that makes sense, and I understand why people do that. But if you want to take the longer view, maybe it's worth considering that there are some politicians who that your coalition is an asset to politicians, and your membership in a coalition is important, and maybe your membership in the coalition and what you can provide to them or threaten to withhold is actually more important than, in the grand strategic sense of the word, than what you do on any given issue, what you do on any given policy disagreement or any scandal that's going on. And that you shouldn't cut ties completely or try to burn bridges or try to destroy someone or try to renounce your former support for a politician just because they don't go all the way or they don't do everything that you want. And instead, you should try to position yourself as a coalition to be valuable to politicians and have them sort of bid for your support. And I think this helps us kind of understand the early period of the Mamdani mayoralship. Mamdani, people are pretty happy with his first 100 days. I think since I filmed the first part of the video, I think I've come a little more on Mamdani's side. I thought that people were overstating it a little bit. He was doing a lot of stuff that mayors would typically do. But I think it's fair now to say that he has maybe been a little more active. He's gotten a little bit more done, and he's picked some fights that maybe he wouldn't usually be able to pick. And I think that probably is because he has a unique coalition, and his coalition is less dependent on existing interests, and his personal charisma and his profile allows him to reach a category of voter that is beyond the sort of petty parochial interest of New York, and maybe he can do more as a politician. And I think if you're an interest group, that's like huge news, right? Like if there's a guy that is going to rely on you and he can ignore the other interest groups to an extent because he doesn't need them, that's a huge asset. And he has made some moves that are fairly conservative. He kept on Tish James on the New York as the New York Police Commissioner, and he has avoided, he's sort of walked back some of his statements. He's going real slow. The grocery stores, he's doing them, but they're going to take a year before any of them really start. And you could respond to this and say, like, yeah, I think this guy's a scumbag and he's a liar, and all politicians, we shouldn't trust them ever. But I think that would be a mistake. And, I don't know that there's a lot of people clamoring to do this to Mamdani the way that they did to AOC or certain other left-wing figures. I think he's still in a pretty good position. But it's important, I believe, to recognize that you're going to these politicians are going to stay around for a long time. And as a member of a faction, as a member of an interest group, you should look past just like what is the issue of the day and how good a job did they do it, and think more about, is this person an asset to what we're trying to accomplish? Are we an asset to them? Are they going to keep us in the coalition? Are we going to be long-term partners? And I think people should think about that in the grand scheme of things. And it's why I think the DSA made it's why I think it's such a horrible mistake that the DSA basically is running AOC out of their party, because she's like one of the best that they've got, and it doesn't make any sense to me. But yeah, the basic summary is, don't burn down everything over individual fights. Look at your position in a coalition in the longer term, and just because somebody passing a bill or taking a measure that is symbolic and doesn't fully achieve everything you want them to might be a stepping stone for them to give you more of what you want, as long as you're important to them and as long as you're a valued member of their coalition.